Well, Jeff, it feels kind of premature to talk about the what if Trump wins and what happens then, and to start kind of planning ahead. But on the other hand, it's almost too late. And we just wrote an article on that because some of the things, and I think 2016 taught us that lesson, some of the things that need to happen in the next 4 years need to start really now, should have started a while back, because otherwise you're always kind of chasing your own tail and you're not going to get there. So, with that in mind, I think we should discuss the article we did. We can do that quite briefly just to sort of look at what needs to be done in the immediate future. And then, kind of more broadly, what can we expect from another 4 years of Trump, and how would it have been different? I think this is a really interesting question. How would it have been different had Trump won in 2020? How would those 4 years have been different to the upcoming 4 years? Again, I know this sounds a bit premature, but these are things that need to be thought about and talked about now, because if you start talking about them later in the year 2025 and so on, the other side is already caught up, and they already have their lawfare going, they already have all these other things going. So it's much better to think ahead and anticipate, isn't it?
It is. And maybe we'll come back to the the what if Trump had won issue in a little bit, because I think that's actually a really powerful topic. But first, we've got the statute of limitations, 5 years. That's running out on things. It's already run out on a ton. You can make some arguments, I would think, and maybe you can help us out on this, but I do think there's some continuation of crime that maybe allows that some older stuff to be carried forward. I know there's some theories that effectively the other side never stops. So the statute of limitations carries all the way up and we've got a year to go. But there needs to be preparation for that. I do take a little bit of solace in what happened with Project 2025 and everything else, Trump's own plan as well, that both things have been sort of twin formulations, slightly different thrusts. Project 2025 is walking through every federal agency, ways to treat those. So I'm hopeful that there's some preparation, but you touched on what the Democrats are doing. And if we've learned any lesson in what you and I kind of do, it's that Democrats are always working tirelessly. And we find out again and again after the fact the number of war games that they walk through and how those war games eerily manage to predict almost down to an exact T, the future. They did it for the 2020 election time and again.
And just to give an example here, who would have known, and just to show you how naive we were kind of collectively, right? Who would have known in October of 2020, exactly 4 years ago when the Hunter laptop came out, that Democrats had war gamed the entire scenario a month or two earlier?
With
Exactly
the
that
media.
happening.
Yeah, with the media, no less.
Yep,
It is
Washington
kind of funny
Post.
because, both of us sort of, I think of, going through what we've gone through, Russiagate and everything else. There's been sort of, we had the sense like the blinders are fully off. We fully see the duplicity of Democrats. But yet, as you say, we wouldn't have predicted those things. Nor would we have predicted the magnitude, at least as I perceive it, the magnitude of the interference in the election itself. I knew Biden was going to be terrible. I looked at as did you, all of his executive orders. I never predicted that it would turn into the utter debacle that it turned into. In other words, even with the hindsight of being completely jaded, it just was even worse than I could have predicted.
Every
all the way
time
around.
every time I think back to any period of time in the past, I always go like, "Oh, I was so naive." And I'm probably going to do that a few years from now, going back to 2024. But that said, it gets less and less over time. And it feels like we never reach the end of the road. So, by the way, my book is out now. So there it is. We have it here
Congratulations.
in print. In
And the
that book,
title is?
Swift Boating America. And in that book, I describe this process where if you think back to 2016, would you have thought that the FBI is totally corrupt, or all these venerable institutions are completely corrupted from the inside? Of course not. And yet, as I explained in the book, we found out more and more, 2018, 19, 20, and so on. Of course, you were all over this as well. I guess with every article you wrote at the time about, new revelations, you felt naive about the previous article. And that's kind of how it is. But I think the important thing to take away from that, and, coming back to our topic here today, is it's important to think about it and talk about it now. November 5th is still a couple of weeks off, but it's important to think about it now, because there's not going to be much time if and when Trump wins to start thinking about it. You need to do it now. And I think there's kind of three general areas. So the first one we really touched upon, it's the one we wrote our recent article on, which is simply, how do we hold those people accountable for all their treachery in Trump's first term? Now, some might think we've got much bigger problems now, and I would agree, and that gets us to the second point. But while we're here on the first point, I think it's important to do that, even if it's on some limited scale. So you already mentioned the 5-year statute of limitations. So that excludes Comey, McCabe, Strzok, all these people. You can't really go after them anymore because of the 5 years that have expired and passed. But there are still a few ideas there on how to hold people accountable for Russiagate, for the Ukraine impeachment, and of course for the COVID scam, the COVID origin scam, which kind of snowballed into a horrible situation and cost Trump the presidency. So I think, first of all, if you'd like to read the details, we'll leave a link to the article. But I think that's sort of the first thing that needs to happen: accountability for all the treachery and the deceptions and the lies in Trump's first term. Because if you don't do that, you're just encouraging the other side. So I think that's just kind of a baseline first step. Then I think there is this much broader issue, which is, how do you clean out the deep state? That's another issue that I think in 2016, and even to an extent in 2020, I certainly underestimated. I certainly was naive. I will admit that, as to how big those problems are. You really need to gut the whole thing. Now, of course, Trump now has a team. He's got Elon, he's got RFK, he's got various other people to help him with that. But that, to me, holding people accountable, that needs to happen, just for justice sake and for all kinds of reasons. But the really big one is, how do you fix the system? And you only got 4 years to do it, and you're not going to be able to fix it all. But how do you do enough of a change? How do you make enough of a change to make it last? And I think the third category is, how do you anticipate and sort of prepare for all the lawfare attacks, all the Democrat tactics, and all the stuff that's going to be going on? So I think those are the kind of three categories I would put things into.
You and I were actually talking a little bit about this offline, and that is, sort of what's coming. And we know factually that the lawfare group has been working to drop, same people that worked in the Democratic war games pre the 2020 election, same people, that they've been working on post-production plans, if you will, in anticipation of Trump winning. And they've come up with, they're working on different ways in which they can try to hobble his presidency, hobble his response to, leftist kind of riots and uprisings and dissension, et cetera. That's been well underway for probably 2 years now. Certainly over the last year, it's been, they're not even trying to hide it. It's out in the open that they're doing that. But this idea, fundamentally, accountability, people have to be held for account. I kind of mentally, as you were saying that word, my mind immediately went to the lawfare crowd, thinking that those are probably the most obvious, easiest candidates. But there has to be some examples made. But the most fundamental thing that we can accomplish, the most transformative, the most desperately needed, is downsizing of our federal government. And I get a lot of hope from having Elon involved in that. Having a mind like that brought in, who's motivated to do it. All of this, though, goes back to not only willingness to do it, but ability to do it. And you really touched on what I think is a powerful point at the start of all this. What would have happened if Trump had actually won in 2020? That maybe the fact, despite everything we've gone through and the ills inflicted on our country over the last 4 years, that maybe those are the things that had to happen. I remember screaming, kind of into the ether every time a big congressional omnibus budget would get put forth. And nobody cared at the incredible waste in spending. Nobody cares. Maybe people would get a little riled for a day, but there was never any traction to do anything about it. And the establishment knew that. They could just kind of put up with a little bit of pushback and it's back to business as usual. Now we may find ourselves in a different vantage point. So I think this idea that you have that, what would it have been like if Trump had won versus what he's gone through, this trial by fire, the lawfare, the attacks, all the court cases, in terms of stealing his resolve, but also in terms of the electorate really kind of waking up, because we're not the only ones that are going through this process. So I think that is really something that's kind of worth spending a little bit of time on.
Absolutely. I mean, you just think back to where were we in 2020, late 2020, early 2021. Trump couldn't even get himself to pardon Julian Assange. Trump couldn't even get the Russiagate documents out. Remember, there's still that binder. We're still waiting for it.
Still,
Um,
yeah, still circulating in the DOJ.
but of course, to be fair, as frustrated as I was about those things, a lot of other things had not happened at that time. No former president had ever been arrested at that time, and now it's happened multiple times, indicted, and on, raided, all those things. There had been assassination attempts, but certainly not as a result of just this widespread vilification of one human being. And Democrats are back at it. So many horrible things have happened. Of course, Afghanistan withdrawal and the hyperinflation, and then the whole collapse of this whole COVID narrative. And of course, the fact that this is another thing that Trump couldn't get himself to, we talked about this on one of the previous shows, to really push through, which is the fact that this thing came out of a lab. So, and that there was a giant cover up. Now, this is kind of a mixed bag, because we knew at the time, it came out of a lab. Trump actually said it, but then he kind of dropped it. But we didn't know all the details. I mean, some of the details we found out 2021, 22, and so on are just so incredible in terms of government corruption, just out and out corruption and cover up and so on. So, we could go on endlessly talking about all the things we found out over the past 4 years, but all of them go in the same direction, namely that the truth is much worse than we actually thought. And we thought it was pretty damn bad back in 2020. So with that in mind, I completely agree.
I mean, we literally had the Biden administration and the FBI directing all big tech to censor Americans. Yep. We didn't know that at the time. We didn't know, as you said, we didn't know about COVID. Just the fact, think about what just came out. The crime stats were released about a month ago, and everybody universally is like, this is bullshit, at least on the right. Whereas on the left, they're holding it up. See, crime fell under Kamala. Well, even then, if you delved into the numbers at that point in time, it was obvious that wasn't the case. And, there was already some of the numbers didn't actually add up with the headlines that were being put out there. But everybody knew that was fictitious. Then what happens? The FBI comes out and quietly alters the numbers to sort of correct them. They're still not corrected. And we could get into that, but suddenly the numbers swing from crime fell 2.9%, whatever it was, to crime was up. Murders were up 4%. And the FBI, they changed the numbers, but they don't even say anything. If it hadn't been for real clear investigations, it might have just gone undiscovered. That kind of thing, showing the duplicity, there's no way to sugarcoat that. The FBI manufactured the numbers lower to get the positive headlines for Kamala, and then quietly, thinking nobody was going to discover it, sort of adjusted the numbers. Believe me, they're going to go higher, get worse.
Same with the labor statistics.
If they were redone every single month.
Exactly. And then, of course, the whole lawfare against Elon Musk. Now we're talking about sort of ancillary. There's not even just Trump anymore. On matters which again, I was probably naive in 2020. I would have never thought they would stop Elon Musk from shooting up rockets. They held up the one that we all just saw recently, the one where they caught the Starship on the same tower where it had just gone up 5 or 10 minutes earlier. I mean, just an absolutely incredible feat. What few people know is that this should have happened in early August. but it was the federal government that just kind of put a stop to it just because they don't like Musk. And now they're trying, was the government in California, they're trying to stop him from launching more rockets over there, which are commercial, which is not even any anything to do with Mars or whatever. And of course, he's being kind of stymied in all kinds of ways simply because he supports Trump. So, yeah, again, we could go on literally all day long looking at all the bad stuff over the past 4 years, which not just about it's not only about it being bad, it's about that we had no idea how bad things were. I mean, that I think is the main point. And this brings us back to our main point here, which is that maybe the fact that, and this might sound a bit controversial, but I'm truly starting to believe this. Maybe the fact that 2020 didn't go the way we wanted it to go for various reasons is going to turn out to be a giant blessing in disguise. Because what would have happened had Trump won? What would have happened if there'd been no shenanigans in Georgia, Arizona, and so on? Well, would have been a narrow victory in any case. And then what? He'd have had a Senate against him, a House against him. He wouldn't have been lame duck. He could have still done executive order stuff and so on. But, we could just see from the mindset that there was at the time, like not releasing the Russiagate binder and so on and so forth. I think he would have just continued doing what he was doing, and it was going in the right direction, and there were good things being done. And I think it would have obviously been a lot better than 4 years of Biden. But I don't think we'd have seen that huge change that is needed. The idea of bringing in, for instance, Elon just to absolutely annihilate the federal government in terms of size and inefficiency and so on and so forth. I don't think we'd have seen all those kinds of initiatives. And so in that sense, I think those 4 years and the horribleness of those 4 years, and we haven't even talked about what happened with immigration during those 4 years. Now the whole build the wall thing, I mean, most Democrats would agree, whereas in 2016, it was the most racist thing ever that anyone could ever say. So I think it probably, if Trump wins, of course, that's the first condition here, it's going to turn out as a good thing because it opened all of our eyes. And we thought they were already wide open in 2020, but we had no idea.
I absolutely think it's the best thing that could have happened. And, unfortunately, sometimes things just have to get so bad before you're able to actually formulate real change. And, you were talking about the fact if Trump had won, what would have happened, and that he would have had sort of a narrow margin and, wouldn't have had a mandate change per se, right? He wasn't going to have, 3/4 of the country behind him or whatever, wasn't going to have Congress any more aligned, maybe less aligned against, line behind him. So it probably would have been kind of I don't want to use the word muddle, that's not exactly fair, but it wouldn't have been any kind of sense of whole-scale sweeping change. And I really do feel like we may have finally hit that point of such intense pain that people are ready to start, maybe backing what really fundamentally needs to be done. So I think that point is outstanding, that it had to get so bad for it to maybe have a chance at getting good. If Trump had gone on for the 4 years and say he's leaving now and it's a battle between whoever, it's almost probably going to be a Dem. History just kind of says things swing back and forth. With the country, we wouldn't have the extra 12 million illegals in our country, and that's enormous. But there's nothing that would have prevented that from happening. Would we have been at a differing vantage point? We wouldn't have had government downsizing. We wouldn't have had massive changes to budgets. We would probably have a lesser level of national debt, but still it probably, it wouldn't have been enormously different. And who knows? If Trump had won coming off of the whole, COVID situation and all the debt we got just from that, might have really hurt him. I think what happened, as much as it was awful and it was painful and it was damaging to our country, that maybe it just had to happen.
And here's the worst part. We haven't even talked about the worst part that would have happened had Trump won in 2020. Control of the Republican Party would now be going back to the elites, would now be going back to the establishment, because you had Mike Pence as the VP. You didn't have all the J.D. Vance, you didn't have Elon, you didn't have the coalitions with RFK, you didn't have any of those things. It would have been Mike Pence was the VP. So he would have been first in line to be the candidate for 2024 had Trump won in 2020. and he would have probably gotten a nomination. But you can't think of a more establishment type than Mike Pence. Remember, J6 and none of that would have happened. And so Trump would then sail off into the sunset. He would have done a lot of good things, but the GOP would be back in the hands of the
Hands of the
establishment.
establishment. And it's
And
easy. That's a great point because it's very easy to, when you bring up Pence, to immediately have a reaction of, oh, what are you talking about? You know, we hate Pence. Well, yeah, you do. But Pence, 2 months before, was giving speeches to adoring crowds when he was telling them, we're going to have our day in court. And he to thunderous applause. You know, Pence, if it's easy to kind of forget about how things were. 2 months before the election finished up, 2 months before the Biden administration, 1 month, Pence was considered the savior and was immensely popular at the time. So it's easy to lose sight of that.
Liz Cheney would have never been exposed. The mask would still be on. So, of course, Trump would have done a lot of good things, but Pence would have been the nominee. I think that's pretty much a given. And he would have probably lost, and everything would have just gone back to normal. The establishment, the GOP establishment, would have really seized control of the party, and that would have been that. And instead, because we had those interceding 4 years, we now have a real passing of the torch. Now, of course, Trump is still around, but for the first time, and we've talked about this on previous shows, for the first time, there's a path going way past Trump. That this whole idea of Trumpism, or whatever you want to call it, is going to live on no matter what happens. And right now it lives on in people like J.D. Vance, but of course there are others too. The movement in many ways has grown deeper and wider. And those intervening 4 years were very important for that to happen.
There's been an ongoing sense of betrayal on the side of conservatives. And, we've reached a point where now I've only been hearing it kind of broadly over the last year. And that is, we don't have a government. I don't know about you, but I was not hearing those words being uttered even in 2023 on kind of a broad basis. Sure, guys like you or me might have been saying it, but in terms of, going on and watching a podcast and hearing those kind of things, we don't have a government. That the Band-Aid has really been ripped off. The DEI exposure that happened. I think actually that's an element that's kind of easy to understate or hard to overstate, having that Band-Aid ripped off. Because that's kind of a Marxist tactic that covers so many other things, and having that removed. And ultimately it comes down to something that we've never had, and that is political will, where there is a true, kind of a sense, and that political will is springing out of anger from being betrayed. And that is something that we haven't really had before. It reflects itself across the viewpoints of the media, which, we just had something come out. They're at the lowest point they've ever possibly been. Congress is in the absolute cellar. The Supreme Court, despite all the noise, is probably the only institution that's got an even mildly positive reputation at this point. Despite all the noise from the left, their perception, it's not actually that bad. So we finally, I think, are at a point where we have an actual opportunity to do something. And, like we started this off with, we wouldn't have had that opportunity in 2020.
Absolutely not. I'm not sure how much of a critical mass has been reached yet, because, of course, Trump hatred, TDS, and so on is still very, very strong. But with all these things that are happening, with this wider coalition, much wider than it's ever been on Trump's side, you can definitely feel something is happening, something is brewing. And there's little images, little things that happen, which on their own, might not mean much, but I think they embed themselves in people's minds, and something bigger grows out of it. And what I have in mind, for instance, just think of Kamala. There's a lot of images I can think of, but there's one I have in mind because it's so perfectly juxtaposed with what Elon did. I think Elon, Twitter is important, and his advocacy for Trump is important. All this stuff is important. But I think by far, far, far the most important thing about Elon is the fact that he has shown that private works better. And much more efficient. He has shown that with very little, you can create so much. You can actually make dreams happen, but it's not going to happen in the government. I mean, that look at NASA versus SpaceX. I mean, it couldn't be more different. And the image I have in mind is, remember when Tim Waltz went on his fake hunting trip when nothing was shot and nothing was done? So there's this one shot where he fumbles around with a shotgun. He doesn't no clue what to do.
Yeah,
And
you
he's
mean when
fumbling
he's
around
holding a
with it.
shotgun for the first time in his life?
It looked like it, yeah. And he was trying to load it. He was kind of fumbling around. So he's standing there, like the tower at SpaceX, kind of. This is where I'm heading with this. And the gun is sort of at an angle, and he's just fumbling around with it. And the very next morning after that happened, you had the image of the tower and the rocket coming back down, also at an angle. And it was just like the perfect juxtaposition. Here's government, just wasteful, full of hot air, fumbling, doesn't know what to do, just waste
Everything's a
everyone's money,
photo
waste
op.
everyone's time. And on the other side, you got just an incredible feat of engineering. It was such a powerful image. And I think, that kind of stuff really resonates with people in the long run. Maybe not like on the day, oh, that's a funny meme or whatever, but that kind of takes hold. And this idea that you can come in and just cut 90% of Twitter staff and the company works just fine. And to do that
The
over and
company
over
works
in all
better.
these different industries, and to have these huge breakthroughs like with SpaceX, and all of that done with small amounts of money compared to what the government does, is very powerful.
I think a couple things. First of all, in my own personal opinion, is Elon's purchase of X was the most important thing because free speech was dying. And we've seen the acceleration of that everywhere else. I'm not sure those other images would have had the power to resonate without the free speech kind of saving that happened with the purchase of X. But the other thing that I've noticed is finally numbers are starting to matter. And what I mean by that is I mean spending. The government wastefulness is so enormous that people just kind of glaze over and all the money sent to Ukraine. And then all of a sudden we have North Carolina happen and we're seeing much smaller numbers in terms of what they're willing to support. And people are suddenly, I feel like, waking up to how much the unbelievable amount of waste that's being generated by a government. You talked about doing more with a lot less. And that's something that I don't think has ever been exposed before. That's kind of why, when I mentioned budgets earlier in this, that we never got any traction on that. It's all just kind of ephemeral numbers, and they're all so big we can't put our hands around them and understand them. And now I feel like there's a greater understanding of people like, oh my God, the government is truly a massive waste, not just a waste, but a waste of my money. Like taxes have never been higher. The feel of it with inflation has never been greater. And now people are starting to realize how much is actually being taken from them and wasted in ways that are almost hard to fathom.
Right. And my own, I mean, just to look at my own journey on this, I've always been against all this, let's send millions of dollars to Somalia for a gender studies program, or all this kind of waste. Rand Paul has been doing this forever. And he has his annual thing where he comes out with all these wasteful things, and that's always been a thing as long as I can remember back. I was always against that stuff in the 2000s and the 90s. Always like that's very very bad. But my own horizon has expanded on this. It's not just that. It goes much further, and Twitter was an important kind of landmark on that journey because it really showed that in this day and age of automation, when you have these staff, they just a lot of staff just sitting around at home because work from home kind of stuff, and they're just playing video games or whatever. Do you really need these people? And as far as government is concerned, I am absolutely convinced that you do not need these people. You could literally just go in and cut at least half, and I think we've talked about this before in the show where we said probably a lot more, without there being any difference whatsoever in terms of output. I'm very convinced of that. And if that happens, even to some degree, if that can be achieved, I think that would be probably the biggest long-term thing that Trump could do in the next 4 years?
We don't even have a true scope of the waste. I think, again, the North Carolina thing was a good example because Hurricane Helene, because people started realizing something that, we've been trying to point to all the money that was going to illegals out of USAID and the State Department. And then we find out that FEMA is not only spending, half their budget on COVID, like, I can't even wrap my mind around that, but they're spending, an incremental couple billion on illegals as well. And it turns out every single federal agency that you and I have looked at is doing things like that, where they're operating in a manner that's completely away from their mission, that really is, more for a DNC/Marxist mission, doing completely unrelated programs and fundings on an enormous scale. And so many things have inverted in terms of the parties and, what the Republicans now represent, what Democrats now represent, and the idea that you could have this new coalition of Elon Musk and RFK and Trump. I don't think that would have been really thinkable, say, a couple years back. And now here we are, and you've got some highly competent people that are coming in that don't agree with Trump on everything, but they agree with him on the big things and feel like they have a mandate to come in and make changes that have never even been contemplated before.
I completely agree. And one thing that, again, has been sort of moved into focus more and more, and maybe is not hugely widely understood yet, but that's where the path is going, is that government waste is becoming more and more obvious, isn't even so much about the actual waste. If it was just the billions and tens or hundreds of billions spent on something or another, fine. But it's the fact that the government waste actually creates much huger problems and much bigger expenses further down the line. So you talked about illegal immigration. So, the billions were spent on bringing people over. Well, but those people need to be taken care of. Those people are going to create a lot of costs over many, many decades and years ahead. So we're actually talking about much bigger numbers. And of course, I think the biggest example of this by far is the $60 billion, which Fauci's organization has every year. That's a ginormous budget. So obviously, people who are not happy with, handing out all this research, Fauci handing out all this so-called research money to all his pet causes, all over the place, cut that budget. But of course, it's much, much worse than that, because part of that 60 billion went to the kind of work that then got us a virus, which cost us 20 trillion. So that's the actual cost. So I think that we're not quite there yet, where people understand that the government waste is not just a waste in terms of the nominal money that's being wasted, but all the extra costs that are being created through that waste further down the line.
That maybe is sort of the core of the anger that's starting to come forth. It wasn't that long ago. I remember when I, was working on the State Department funding, and I was shocked. This was something that wasn't common news at the time, the fact that the State Department was spending as much as it was on the infrastructure that was then funneling the illegal immigration into our country. So here you had, not only was our government opening the doors and allowing the illegal immigration problem, but they were funding the creation of the infrastructure to do, they were paying for we were paying for the problem, the creation of the problem. And of course, the subsequent costs to that dwarf any of the initial outlays. That's exactly right. So it was this idea, this revelation that, holy crap, not only are we, on a legislative basis allowing this to happen through executive orders and Biden's actions, but we're funding it, and therefore we're then embracing all the future costs from that. And I think that's right, that is what's really getting people's attention and ire, is, oh my God, we're not just allowing this, we're paying for it to create further problems, which just create much greater payments. And COVID's a great example. Funding the overseas labs to a tune of, hundreds of millions of dollars, whatever it was. And what was the resultant effect was a problem that was absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah, no, exactly right. So maybe just to kind of close it here on an overview, I would, first of all, right now start focusing on holding accountable whoever can still be held accountable in terms of past treachery and past deceptions and so on and so forth. We're talking Russiagate, we're talking Ukraine, where there's never been any accountability, Ukraine Gate in the impeachment, and of course COVID, Fauci, and so on. With Fauci, I think we have the biggest chance of still doing something about that because the 5 years aren't up yet. Then day one, get Elon, get other people in there to really just gut the deep state, just start gutting it and just wholesale. And then, of course, that ties in with the third issue we talked about, which is the pushback, the lawfare. The judges in Hawaii are going to be called upon to put a stop to all these things and so on. And I think the best way to deal with this is to learn the lessons we've learned over the past 8 years. Most of all, just ignore the noise. Okay, the judge in Hawaii you're going to have to deal with. The judge in Seattle or whatever you're going to have to deal with. But eventually, those things go up the chain. And, for the next few years at least, we can expect the Supreme Court to still be relatively sane. There's not a guarantee, but, if things reach there, we know that it will probably turn out okay. So just let that process play out. You can't avoid that. You got the judge in Hawaii, you got to deal with it. But all the other things, I think the lesson that we learned is just ignore it. So they come up with the new Russiagate. Just ignore it. Say, this is a bunch of lies. It's got nothing to do with me. Just move on. Ignore it. And part of ignoring is don't go and talk to the media, the legacy media. Just don't go on their shows. Total boycott. Nothing. Just don't go there. Don't go on their shows. Don't talk to them. Don't give them a moment airtime. Nothing. Just completely freeze them out. They can talk to Democrats all day long. Then it can just be a little club where they do their thing and just forge on with the bigger project, which is to gut the deep state. And ignore the noise.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I've been saying it for a while now, but the single most important thing in my mind that can come out of all of this is a smaller government, just dramatically slashing across the board at every agency. And if there's any one single thing that can come out of a new Trump presidency, that's what I most, hope for. I don't know that we're going to get it, but that's the thing that is the most important is a transformational downsizing. And you're exactly right. To the extent that you legally are able to do so, just ignore everything. You're here for a job and you just don't, they're going to oppose you. Don't care. Don't rise to the bait. Just do what you're there to do.
Think of General Flynn. Why was he fired? Bad Washington Post and New York Times headlines. That's why the guy was fired. They ran bad stories. It's very early on. Well, we better just kind of get rid of him. That then kicked off this whole, if you going to get rid of Flynn, there must have been some really bad stuff going on, and let's have a special counsel. And the whole thing kind of, so what's the lesson? Just ignore whatever they say. Just ignore. The Washington Post runs a headline. So what? You guys are fake news. You lie about everything. We've exposed you. 8 years of lies. No, forget about it. Not going to talk to you. Just ignore it. And
who's fantastic at that? J.D. Vance.
Yep, put him in charge of talking to the media every day. I know he's got a full plate and stuff, but he's so good at it. He'd be better than any press secretary. Just let him deal with it.
What a phenomenal skill set. So, just let him laugh at the media because that's what they deserve, ridicule. Ignore, move forward, and downsize.